Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So text 8 we can chant responsively. So 10:44:8. Kva vajra sara sarvango. Kva vajra sara sarvango. Malo shailendra sanibo. Malo shailendra sanibo. Kva chati sukumarango. Kishorao naptayovano. Kva vajra sara sarvango. Malo salendriya sanibo. Kva chati sukumarango. Kishorao naptayovano. Kva vajra sara sarvango. Malo salendra sanibo. Kva chati sukumarango. Kishorao naptayovano. Please chant. Sarango. Malo salendra sanibo. Svakachi sukumarango. Kishora maptasyovano. Avajra sara sarvango. Mailao salendra sanibo. Kvachati sukumarango. Kishora naptayovano. And the word for word. Cow. Where on the one hand. Vajra. Of lightning. Sara. With the strength. My computer has changed something. Just let me check what this is. When I see an English word for the Sanskrit, then I know the computer's changed it. I think it's sarva, all. Angao, whose limbs. Malao, two wrestlers. Saila, mountains. Indra, like the chief. Sanibal, whose appearance. Kwa, where. Cha, and on the other hand. Ati, very. Sukumara, tender. Angao, whose limbs. Kishorao, two youths. Not having yet attained. Yovano, their maturity. And the translation for text 8 is as follows. What comparison can there be between these two professional wrestlers with limbs as strong as lightning bolts and bodies resembling mighty mountains, and these two young immature boys with exceedingly tender limbs? And text 9. Dharma vyatikramo hi asya samajasya dhruvan bhavet yatra dharma samushriten nastayam tatra karichit. And the translation for text 9. Religious principles have certainly been violated in this assembly. One should not remain for even a moment in a place where irreligion is flourishing. And text 10. Na shabam pravishet prajnaha shabya doshan anusmaran abruvan vibruvan agno naraha kilpisham ashnute. And the translation for text 10. A wise person should not enter an assembly if he knows the participants there are committing acts of impropriety. And if, having entered such an assembly, he fails to speak the truth, speaks falsely, or pleads ignorance, he will certainly incur sin. Om Gyana Simrandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurin Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Jivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute. Tapsa Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Vanchakalpatarubhyas cha kripa sindhubhya cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnebhyo namo namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Roma Padaswami Iti Namine. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I'm going to read, actually, I think I'm diving first of all into text 9. So I'm going to read text 9, actually. Religious principles have certainly been violated in this assembly. One should not remain for even a moment in a place where irreligion is flourishing. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur comments for text 9 that I've just read, and this is his comment. The woman said, certainly, so this is the ladies of Mathura at the site of Krishna and Balaram facing these two wrestlers. The woman said, certainly there is irreligion. So the words used were dharma, vatikramaha. In this assembly, and the assembly was samasyasya, so no one should stay here. Therefore, we should immediately leave this place. Close quote. Um, so the woman, they had a particular concern in that they were seeing two professional wrestlers with bodies, and quoting this, these were their words, resembling mountains. And they were seeing two young, immature boys with, and these are their words, I'm quoting, exceedingly tender limbs. So the ladies are concerned that there's an unfair match, and that the respectable members of the assembly should not remain there to witness such an unfair match. So Srila Prabhupada, he states that in general, people always should require a teacher who can teach the public practical behavior. So, because you could say the ladies of Mathura make up the public or part of the public in this assembly. And the ladies themselves had in fact stated this, and this is quoting them, as the king watches this fight between the strong and the weak, they, meaning the royal assembly, also want to see it. So Srila Prabhupada gives an example of who a teacher is. And or rather, he gives an example of the role that the teacher takes in communicating something. So obviously, I'm drawing or going into this particular facet and definition because the king is equivalent to a teacher, and they have actually noted that the king is going to watch this match between the strong and the weak. So meaning that the Royal Assembly then also wants to see it. So what Srila Prabhupada is helping to define is that role of the teacher, meaning like the king or a school teacher. And he gives an example. So a teacher can't teach the public to stop smoking, for instance, if the teacher himself, herself is smoking. So in this case, the king's willingness to watch this unfair fight, so to speak, is teaching the public to watch this unfair fight. So naturally, a king or the head of the executive head of the state, even one's father, the school teacher, they all can be seen as natural leaders of innocent people. So it means that they're setting, in some sense, the example for particular conduct. So as per Srila Prabhupada, this is how he explains it. So by virtue of this fact, that they're in this position of responsibility, they have a responsibility to their dependents. And that responsibility is of leading or teaching their dependents. And it necessitates them, in order to be able to teach, it necessitates that they're conversant with bodies of moral and spiritual codes. Because if you're in that position, you have to know the moral and spiritual codes. Because you have to be able to model perfect behavior. And why it's necessary to model perfect behavior is because it gets imbibed and imitated by all the dependents. So, and Lord Krishna himself states this kind of understanding there of this great responsibility that these persons in leadership have. So this is how Krishna puts it. I'll read the Sanskrit first and give the translation. Yat yat acharat shrestas tat tat eva paro janaha sayat paramanam kurut lokas tat anuvartate. Whatever action, and this is a translation, whatever action a great man performs, common men follow. And whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. So you can see what a huge responsibility somebody in a leadership position has, whether it's over having numerous dependents like a king or a queen, having an entire country dependent on them and their understanding of proper behavior according to moral codes, or whether it's in a simple family unit, there's a huge responsibility. So this was from Bhagavad Gita 3:21. So an ideal teacher has to behave properly himself, which means the teacher is following the principles of Shastra, and the Shastras may be Manu Samhita and similar standard books. So there's books of ethics, books on moral codes. So in the Maxims of Chanakya, so Chanakya was a great politician, and he actually explored the various scriptures and produced certain maxims. So these are codes of ethics. And so here, one of his maxims is advice that's given to rulers, because we're looking at what the king is performing in this particular circumstance that these ladies are observing. So this is what advice he gives to rulers or somebody in the position of a king. By excessively cruel punishment, the ruler becomes hated by all. So, the ladies are noting, this incongruity that there's these mountainous wrestlers and then these tender-limbed young boys. So it would seem that the king, in fact, is actually meting out punishment. So the maxim of Chanakya is that by excessively cruel punishment, the ruler becomes hated by all. And for the citizens, there's a similar code of ethics, and this is the one of the maxims of Chanakya, so an ethical code. One should not act against the ruler. So that's the code of ethics for the citizens. So this has significance because you notice here, the ladies are believing that there's been some transgression in the code of ethics, and they themselves, however, have this obligation that they are shouldn't be acting against the ruler. I mean, that's the code of ethics they have to follow. So in this particular situation, as per Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the ladies were actually pointing with their fingers. So usually, when one's a little bit accusatory or, really wants to put stress on something, the finger may point. So they were actually pointing with the fingers as they described the soft bodies of Krishna and Balaram. So it's like being a little aghast. You point. So these particular ladies are merely raising a question. So they're not actually up in arms. They aren't storming out of the assembly, but they're raising a question. So any thoughtful person, when confronted with some situation that, sets off a need to examine the ethics of the situation, has to be able to formulate an intelligent question. And that's what they're doing. So even if the king, this is them, even if the king somehow wanted to see such an unfair match, so they're bringing up this question, why should the respectable members of the assembly desire to see such a fight? So they're raising a question. Maybe the king somehow wants to see such an unfair fight, but why should the assembly see it? So the particular maxim applicable to the citizens would not be breached. Because remember, the maxim for the citizens is that they're not supposed to go against the ruler. But it wouldn't be breached because the ladies are indicating that there's a kind of voluntary nature involved in this attendance at this fight. It's voluntary. So, so it means that there's room. One could choose to leave the fight or not. Now, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur brings up that there's another group of women who quote the rules of the scriptures. So these ladies, they actually point it out clearly. So they say, we have committed offense by coming here. If someone knows that there is injustice in an assembly and remains silent, or else speaks contrary to irreligious principles, or acts as if ignorant, saying, I don't know, even though one does in fact know, in any of these cases, he will certainly incur sin. So these ladies are stating what the code of ethics should be. So means if you're observing injustice in some big assembly, then if you're remaining silent, or even if you're speaking something that's contrary to religious principles, or even if you say, I don't really know, still you're going to incur sin. Therefore, one shouldn't enter the assembly. This is what they're thinking. So whatever your situation is, you being silent, you're saying, I don't know, or even if you're speaking something contrary to irreligious principles, you should still not enter the assembly. So this is what these ladies are concluding, considering the ethics or the morality in the choice that has to be made here, being confronted by something that seems completely unjust. So Srila Prabhupada in Krishna book, he has always a very beautifully simple way of expressing. So this is Srila Prabhupada in Krishna book, how he expresses this problematic situation, just writing of these ladies. So this is how Srila Prabhupada puts it. The principle of justice has already left this assembly. Persons who are aware of the civilized principles of justice will not remain to watch this unfair match. Those taking part in watching this match are not very much enlightened. Therefore, whether they speak or remain silent, they are being subjected to the reactions of sinful activities. So, again, the picture that's been painted is that justice has left this assembly. Just by virtue of this fight that's been arranged between two very young, tender-limbed boys and two mountainous, huge wrestlers with arms that move like lightning bolts. They're so powerful and so fast. So according to Chanakya, a fight between equals is like the collision of one unbaked pot with another. It destroys both. So that's the ethical code. When it's between equals, both will get destroyed. It's like, if you imagine earthen pots hitting each other, they'll both shatter. On the other hand, Chanakya's other maxim is that, and this is him speaking, in a fight with an inferior, one attains absolute victory like the strong lifting an earthen pot. So it's quite different where there's that inequality in strength. The strong is easily going to be, it's equivalent to just being able to easily lift an earthen pot. So That's what happens when the fighting is with an inferior. And this is what the ladies are perceiving. Young boys versus, adults, huge experienced wrestlers. So to the woman, the latter appears to be the situation. It's just going to be that these wrestlers are going to lift these boys like with ease and, be able to throw them to the ground, because that's what the wrestler is supposed to do, to use their strength and bring somebody to the ground. So they think this will be obvious. This must be the situation. So there's bound to be victory for the wrestlers. That's what they're thinking. It seems that they've identified the victims of injustice. It seems. Injustice usually means not being just or not lawful. Or there is an absence of righteousness. That's what injustice means. So the conventional pictorial representation of injustice, this is in our society, it shows a devil breaking the scales of justice, tearing the blindfold from the eyes of the personality of justice and beating her up. That's how injustice is portrayed in contemporary society. So if one looks at such an image, in common society, injustice simply destroys justice. That's what the understanding would be. So the rules of justice, they're designed to control or to eliminate injustice. So one understands what must be avoided. So that's in modern society. That would be, injustice is going to destroy justice, so therefore you need to avoid injustice. So of course, one can consider that the king himself had given the order for this match to take place. So remember, the king is in that position of great responsibility because what he dictates is followed by the citizens. So he himself was the person who had given the instruction for this match to take place. So going back to what his instruction had been, he had said, long before this match took place, "My dear heroic Chanura and Mustika, please hear this. Rama and Krishna, the sons of Anakundubi Vasudev, are living in Nanda's cowherd village. It has been predicted that these boys will be the cause of my death. When they are brought here, kill them on the pretext of engaging them in a wrestling match." So this was in the 36th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam. And he says, "Erect a wrestling ring with many surrounding viewing stands and bring all the residents of the city and the outlying districts to see the open competition." So the king is giving this order. He's given an order for these two young boys to be killed by the wrestlers. And he's actually saying, make an arrangement so that all the residents of the city and even the outlying districts, they come to this particular fighting arena. So a whole arena was created for this purpose. So he had a plot to kill Krishna and Balaram. It was a plot, because you're presenting one thing, there's going to be a fight, but in actual fact, his intention is to kill the two young boys. So it's even worse than the ladies are thinking. They're just thinking, well, somehow he's wanting to wash this unfair fight. But in actual fact, he arranged it and he gave instructions to the two wrestlers that they had to not just wrestle with the two boys, that it was going to be a fight, whoever's strength was greater, that would be the victor, but rather that they had to assure the death of these two boys, Krishna and Balaram. So from a modern standpoint, you have something called distributive justice, where a society has rules that allow something to be just. Because those rules correspond to the basic ethical beliefs of the society. So in a warrior society, the brave must be rewarded. So that would be the particular justice. It's a distributive justice. It's that is right is based on the belief system of the society. So the belief system of the society in this particular case is that the brave must be rewarded. So Chanura and Mustika are in fact called by Kamsa heroic. They've been called heroic by Kamsa because they will be performing an action that is in line with the order of the king. So for him, they're heroic. But Krishna describes the natural qualities of work for the Kshatriya or the warrior. So these are the qualities the Kshatriya or the warrior is supposed to have: heroism, power, determination, resourcefulness, courage in battle, generosity, and leadership. So the problem lies in the fact that the ethical belief for the ruler's duties and qualities is the following. So this is the ethic, the moral code that exists for a ruler. The ruler who has controlled his senses is religious, venerates ascetics, is righteous, and interested in the welfare of his subjects, is competent to protect his people. So that's the code of ethic for a ruler. This is from Maxims of Chanakya, because he's dealing with politics. So the activities of Kamsa as a ruler is best described in the description of his particular demoniac rule. And I'm quoting from Bhagavad Gita because you can see the difference between the code of ethics that's there for a ruler and how Kamsa is functioning. The demoniac who are lost to themselves and who have no intelligence engage in unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. And this, I believe, truly describes this particular ruler, King Kamsa. This is from Bhagavad Gita 16:10. Because the explanation is that he holds no concept of God. So he's a materialist. And the activities he's engaging in are leading to destruction. So it's completely contrary to the normal code of ethics for a ruler. He plans to kill Vasudev, so the father of these two young boys. So not only is he going to kill these two young boys, he's going to kill the father and all the relatives. The Vrishnis, the Bhojas, the Dasartas. And he's also going to kill his own father, Ugrasena, because he believes his own father is actually envious of him having a kingdom. And he's going to kill his own brother, Devaka. And he's going to suppress any king who's opposed to him, who's not allied with him. And he says it. In this way, he's going to rule the world. So you can see the path of destruction that's there. So it's, one could say there's no intelligence, just like the particular description of a demoniac ruler. No intelligence, in the whole-scale slaughter, even of, well, he's seen these two boys as the cause of his death, but he's going to also kill the father, and then their entire dynasty. So definitely unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. Definitely fits that description. Now, in terms of the other group of women who say that a wise person should not enter an assembly if he knows the participants are committing acts of impropriety. So there's another group of women. You shouldn't even go, you shouldn't even enter that assembly if you know that those that are involved in what's going on, it's improper. So Srila Vishwanath, he continues. So this is Srila Vishwanath commentary. This prohibition against entering the assembly is for the wise person who is concerned with worldly activities, and not for the wise person who is indifferent to such. So here comes a very subtle distinction that's been made. They're different persons who are on different levels in terms of their intelligence and what's been called being wise. There's those who hold a concern for material activities, so they know the codes of ethics, and they're very concerned that on the material level you do the right thing. And then there are those who know the codes of ethics, but they're concerned on a transcendental level that you do the right thing. So he gives an example. This is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. He says in Mahabharata, during a gambling match where Draupadi suffered her misfortune, she was being disrobed, in the royal assembly, wise men such as Bhishma, who were concerned with worldly affairs, simply stood silently. So here's somebody wise, certainly knows the codes of ethics, certainly knows that a lady should not be disrobed publicly, but he stands silently. So he knows the code of ethics. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that in his particular case, he's concerned with worldly affairs. So he's concerned with, how it's actually going to play out for him according to his allegiance to the particular party he has allegiance with. So it becomes, he's concerned with the worldly picture of things, not the immediately moral impropriety that's happening. So, whereas, this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur drawing a contrast, the learned Vidura, who was indifferent to ordinary affairs, he exclaimed, and this was Vidura's words, and you talk about religious duty? Because he's horrified. In his case, there's action that needs to be performed. In that moment when the moral codes are actually being violated. But looking from the transcendental level, so putting aside personal interest. So there's no interest in worldly affairs. You consider what's right in front of you and whether it's actually on the transcendentally level correct. So wise persons in the wrestling arena, this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, are afraid of Kamsa because they are overly attached to worldly affairs. So there's that category of persons. They're actually thinking, oh, no, I've got to stay here. I've got to watch this. I'm afraid of the king. They know that the code of ethics has been broken, because if you remember, the definition of an unfair match, or where there's an inferior, the code of ethic is that in such a case, the powerful will easily lift the weaker. So it's an unfair match. But the persons, and this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the persons who take part in watching the fight that are attached to worldly affairs, I'm going to conclude based on what Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur said, because that was his conclusion, because they're overly attached to worldly affairs. So the persons who take part in watching the fight that are attached to worldly affairs, the argument is that it is these persons that are going to incur sin. That's what Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says. So, going further, Socrates, I'm drawing from, Western philosophy. Socrates states that no action can be virtuous unless it is based on the knowledge that moral wisdom provides. The knowledge of what makes the good guides action or motivates action. So this is Socrates, and generally in our society, we're following Western philosophy. So this is Western philosophy. And action can only be virtuous when it's based on knowledge that moral wisdom has provided. So it's moral wisdom. You're not going to team up two young teenage boys with two adults, super experienced wrestlers. Looking immediately at the situation, not considering the history of these particular young boys, that they're not ordinary, but just in the immediate situation, and the fact that, you have allegiance as a citizen to the king. So the action can't be virtuous unless it's based on knowledge. So you could say that the moral knowledge tells you it's an unfair fight. Moral knowledge tells you that actually you have allegiance to the king. But then you have to consider what's the good action that's to be performed here. So this is Socrates. Now, Srila Vishwanath, he says that there's a group that has to be indifferent to worldly affairs. And these are these ladies that are pointing at the tender limbs of Krishna and Balaram. So the viewing has to be done in service to the Supreme Lord. Then there has to be no fear. Then there's no fear of degradation. So if one were there as a citizen who has, the moral code is you have to have allegiance to your king, and you faced with this moral quandary, then if you were to have to watch that match, taking your role as a citizen who has to have allegiance to the king, and you know that the moral code also is that this is an unfair match. You know, it's the weak are going to be picked up like a little earthen pot by the strong. If one does that as a service to the Supreme Lord, viewing that match, then there's no need to have this fear of becoming degraded. So it's only if the actions are done for personal sense gratification. So somebody is, there's fighters who are watching this match, and they're actually eager to see the destruction of these two boys because they truly have deep allegiance to Kamsa and his particular lack of adherence to moral ethics. Then those will be the persons that for whom there's going to be bondage. They're going to be incurring sin. So here from Bhagavad Gita, I'm going to draw from 1849 that explains a little bit when you incur sin and when you don't incur sin. One who is self-controlled and unattached and who disregards all material enjoyments can obtain, by practice of renunciation, the highest perfect stage of freedom from reaction. So the criteria are there for how you will not get any reaction for the particular action you take. So the thinking is, I'm a part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and so the work that I'm performing, viewing this match, is enjoyed by the Supreme Lord. It requires being very self-controlled. And in this particular case, it's having faith that Krishna is extremely powerful. So, and there's going to be pleasure obtained from the transcendental happiness of performing this service to the Lord. So even though on a moral level, one can't be present at such a match, on a transcendental level, there's going to be happiness once performing that service of sitting there and observing this match as service to Lord Krishna. Of course, the recognition of injustice, it can be acknowledged naturally, rather than that there's some indifference. So the ladies are particularly being soft-hearted, and obviously it's a very clear transgression of moral codes. They're not being indifferent. They're acknowledging that there's injustice. But the acknowledgement need not be the kind that where there's politics involved or the protest is based on some conviction. So this is where there's a very fine line of when you start looking at injustice. And for example, people who take up the cause of wretched people of the world, although they themselves may not be suffering from a personal sense of injustice. Like, for instance, I could say that I fell into this category at one point because I came from a country where there was a lot of injustice. Like, it was even written into the law. So for myself, when the law changed, I thought I had some duty to make some contribution, because I knew that some persons had experienced so much injustice, even though myself, I was not on the receiving end of the injustice. So one year I remember I went and did a teaching project in what would previously have been a community that was experiencing injustice. So somebody who acts as a political agent and chooses to identify with the victim, and they act on behalf of the victim because they're believing that's how the victim should act. So sometimes you're going to see that persons take a stand for the enfeebled victim. They've seen the victim as, somehow being feeble in a way, and now they're going to stand on behalf of that victim. This is quite common. I think in there's examples, let's say, during racial segregation, maybe there wouldn't be buses for a certain category of people, but buses for another category of people. So then somebody who's in the category of not having the injustice, experiencing the injustice themselves, they may take up the position of, protesting that there aren't buses for the disadvantaged group. So they're standing on behalf of the enfeebled victim. But that's not the case here. For these ladies of Mathura, they're apprehending some danger to Krishna in their ecstatic love for him. So there's a disturbance in the heart by seeing the mountainous bodies of the wrestlers. And in fact, they're expressing some love for Krishna through this disturbance in their heart. But I've explored it, or tried to explore this whole picture from the ethical standpoint, and also touching on the transcendental viewpoint that overrides ethics, but still takes it into account, but how one can override it and when it's necessary to override it. So in this case, these ladies had an understanding that of the personality of Krishna from the point of view of their love for him. So everything was motivated by concern for him. So if there's any thought on this matter, I hope I explored it adequately and clearly.
There is a lot of thought-provoking, subjects, in the presentation, in the class. One thing that is there is that you quoted Chanakya Pandit, given the direction or the code of action for a regular citizen, or a person who is under a leader, that you should not go against the leader. And of course, when the leader is corrupt, or the leader is not acting properly, then it seems that then there's a conundrum there for the follower, for the citizen. What do you do? And the situations we hear from Srila Prabhupada that, well, actually the scriptures, if the spiritual master is fallen, one can give up the spiritual master. One can give up a leader that is fallen. So so I guess, there's more to it in terms of, following someone who is not a proper leader. So then, there's other codes that apply. So that code must apply to not go against a proper leader, not a so-called leader. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in this case, the ladies are actually calling for a boycott to the whole arrangement that Kansa has made. They say, if you're wise, how can you be present here? How can you accept this? So so they're doing that, and they're doing that aloud, and they're, it is explained later that Vasudeva and Devaki, they were hearing, and they were, also upset about what they're hearing, in terms of they also feel, this anxiety, this concern about, this unfair, thing. But they stay there. I guess, because Krishna is there, they stay. But they're calling for this. And then there's something else that I thought. I mean, it made me think a lot, this. So, I mean, it was very wonderful that you read what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur said about that there is a distinction when you make this justice call, that if you do it with from the material perspective, that's one thing, and it's different when you do it from the transcendental perspective. So one have to see, what is one's motivation, if it's mixed with some material intention, some personal intention, or if it's purely trying to align with Krishna's, plan. Which is the case, of many who were present in that arena. They were aligned with Krishna's plan. And there were some that were not aligned with Krishna's plan, so that's what they think. So that's another thing. And one last point, sorry.
I'm delighted that it's been thought through, thank you.
And then there is a case of, Kshatriyas. There's citizens and there's Kshatriyas, so leaders. So in the case of other leaders who are witnessing a leader who is fallen, who is actually hurting those who are under, those who are dependents, they cannot, they necessarily instruction is not to, be passive like the citizens that they have to follow. Another leader have to correct the situation, So we have the case of Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra. They were the leaders at that time. By hook or by crook, they were placed in that position. Bhima, with grandfather Bhishma, have to, stand by them according to the codes, to the vows that he made, and, all this type of thing. But Krishna induced the Pandavas to actually do something about this irreligious thing that was happening. So you have to be part of the corrective. You don't have the choice to, okay, this is the king, we have to follow. You have to act to be part of the corrective, situation. So that's some.
Well, that's a very nice point, because what you're raising is that the corrective measure need not be on the part of the citizens, but rather on the part of a leader who's then actually working on the same level as the corrupt leader in terms of correcting the misdemeanors. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very significant point, because the instrument of change certainly has to be a person who's on the same level as the leader. Yes, I think that's a very significant point. Thank you. So in this particular case, it's interesting because in the very center of that improper, morally questionable scenario that's presenting itself, that self-same leader is standing there, Krishna, and he is going to come head on with the ruler who isn't actually adhering to moral codes. And in fact, the way Krishna comes to deal with that ruler Kamsa is to eliminate him completely. So that was the justice in that situation. So the justice from the point of view of Krishna, who was the proper leader, was to fight the fight, and at the same time, immediately after the fight, kill that ruler too. So, yeah, quite extraordinary. I mean, Krishna's particular demonstration of creating order in society, so to speak, when there's so much consternation that's caused by a ruler who's acting improperly. Yeah, or in a very demoniac way, with no proper regard for the citizens, actually. That the citizens should be so disturbed is an indication that the ruler is not functioning properly. So, yeah. If there's nothing else. Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.